The wolf didn't blink. Iris had noticed it 3 days ago. A massive creature with silver-touched fur, watching from the tree line across Millbrook Road. Most people would have called animal control. Most people would have felt simple fear. But Iris felt something else. A magnetic pull, as if invisible threads were drawing her toward those feral golden eyes. She told herself it was just a wolf, possibly a stray, possibly sick. She told herself many things as she stood at her kitchen window, coffee cooling in her hands, transfixed. The cabin she'd rented was supposed to be her escape. 3 months of solitude in the Colorado peaks, away from the suffocating expectations of her family's estate in Boston. Away from the carefully curated life her mother had designed for her before she was even born. Iris was 28 years old and had never made a single choice that was entirely her own, until she'd simply left. The wolf tilted its massive head, and even from 200 yards away, she felt the intelligence in that gesture. This was no ordinary animal. There was something knowing in the way it watched her, as if it saw through the cabin walls, through her skin, straight into the trembling core of her being. A shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the November cold, seeping through the old windows. She'd always been sensitive to things others couldn't perceive. As a child, she'd seen shadows move wrong, felt presences in empty rooms. Her family's psychiatrist had called it hypervigilance, a trauma response, perhaps. Her mother had called it theatrical. Iris had learned to keep quiet about the strange pull in her chest, the way certain places felt alive with intention, the dreams that bled into waking with too much clarity. Here in the cabin, those sensitivities had sharpened. The mountain air felt charged, like the moment before lightning. And the wolf. God, the wolf made her skin electric. She pressed her palm against the cold window glass. The wolf's ears flicked forward. It rose to its full height, 7 feet, maybe more, and Iris's breath caught. No natural wolf was that large. No natural wolf moved with that predatory grace, that purpose. Its silver fur caught the weak afternoon light like moonshine captured in flesh. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, deliberately, the wolf turned and loped back into the pines, its massive form dissolving into shadow and mist like it had never been there at all. Iris released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. That night, she dreamed. She stood in a forest of ancient trees, their trunks wider than houses, their canopy so thick that only threads of starlight pierced through. Moss beneath her bare feet was soft as velvet, and the air tasted of ozone and rain and something wild, something that made her mouth water and her pulse quicken. A shadow moved between the trees. Not the wolf. Something larger. Something that radiated heat and power and a grief so profound it bent the world around it. The shadow had eyes that burned like amber coals, and when it looked at her, she felt seen, truly seen, in a way that transcended vision. It saw every hurt she'd ever swallowed, every dream she'd abandoned, every time she'd made herself small to fit into someone else's expectations. "Don't come closer," a voice said. It was gravel and thunder, spoken directly into her mind. "You can't be here. You can't be near me." "Why?" she whispered. "Because I'll destroy you. Because being near me is death. And you—" The voice fractured, raw and aching. "You deserve to live." She reached toward the shadow, but it was already dissolving, pulling back into the forest, leaving her alone with the weight of its anguish. She woke gasping, her heart thundering, the taste of forest still on her tongue. The next morning, she found a deer at the edge of her property. Not killed, just placed there. Its eyes were open, still warm, and the claw marks on its throat were distinctive, massive, precise, surgical almost. A message. I was here. I killed this for you. No, that wasn't rational. Wolves didn't leave gifts. Wolves didn't communicate with human women through symbolic hunting. Iris called the local ranger station anyway. The woman who answered, her voice bright with the practiced cheer of someone bored with her job, assured her it was likely a mountain lion. Happened all the time. She should keep her distance if she saw one, and absolutely lock her doors at night. Iris locked every door in the cabin. Then she locked them again. But she didn't go back to her room. Instead, she sat at the kitchen window, watching the tree line, waiting for that massive silver shape to emerge from the pines, waiting to feel that strange electric pull again. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Your father is asking when you're coming home. Don't be difficult, darling." Iris turned the phone face down. The forest watched her, and somewhere in that vast darkness of pine and shadow and ancient stone, something with golden eyes and a shattered heart was watching too. On the fourth night, the wolf came closer. She'd left the back door unlocked, whether consciously or unconsciously, she couldn't say. It was standing in her kitchen when she came downstairs at midnight, drawn by a pull she couldn't name and couldn't resist. The space seemed too small for such a vast creature. Its shoulder brushed the doorframe. Its breath came heavy and controlled, the breath of something keeping itself in check through sheer will. Up close, she could see the scars beneath its silver fur, old wounds that had healed into strange patterns, as if the wolf had survived things that should have been fatal. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. The wolf made a sound low in its chest, not quite a growl, something softer, something that sounded like sorrow. Then it was gone, melting back into the darkness like smoke, and Iris was left alone in her kitchen, trembling, wondering if she'd imagined it. But on the counter, where the wolf had stood, it had left a gift, an old, tarnished silver locket, engraved with symbols she didn't recognize. And inside, a woman's face, dark-haired, fierce-eyed, undeniably familiar. Familiar because she had Iris's chin, Iris's cheekbones, Iris's eyes. Her hands shook as she opened her laptop and typed, "Bloodline, Curse Mythology. Silver Wolves. Omega Prophecy." The search results spiraled into folklore and fantasy, into story and legend. But nestled among the fiction were older texts, academic papers on folklore, anthropological accounts of isolated communities in Eastern Europe, of packs that moved like myth through the mountains, accounts that described a prophecy, an omega born to an alpha bloodline, carrying gifts that could either break or save her kind, accounts that spoke of bonds that transcended choice, of fate that wore teeth and fur and eyes like burning gold. At 3 a.m., Iris closed the laptop and returned to the window. The forest was still, the mountains breathing their ancient, patient breath. But she could feel it now, the presence she'd sensed before, waiting in the darkness. Not coming closer, she whispered to the night, to the unseen watcher, to the destiny that was unspooling like a thread around her heart. "I'm coming to you." She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know if it was safe. But for the first time in her carefully controlled life, Iris was certain of one thing. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Sleep became impossible. Iris lay in the darkness of her bedroom, the locket clutched in her fist, feeling the weight of it like a brand. The silver was warm, impossibly warm for metal left in a cold cabin, and it thrummed against her palm in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Or perhaps her heartbeat was matching it. The phenomenon was impossible. Metal didn't pulse. Destiny didn't announce itself in antique jewelry. And yet here she was, at 4 a.m., wide awake and hypersensitive to every sound in the cabin. The creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the soft padding of something massive moving around the exterior. He was still here. The wolf. The watcher. The presence that had invaded her dreams and turned her rational world sideways. She got out of bed. Against every instinct that screamed danger, Iris descended the stairs barefoot, still wearing the old silk nightgown she'd packed weeks ago. The locket swung against her sternum, warm and alive. The moment her feet touched the hardwood of the first floor, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The kitchen window revealed nothing but darkness and the vague shapes of the pine forest beyond. But she could feel him out there, a pull so intense it was almost painful, like a fishhook embedded behind her ribs, drawing her toward the glass. She pressed her forehead against the cold pane. "I know you're there," she whispered. "I know you're whatever you are, and I know you're—" She paused, searching for the word. Afraid? No. Something more layered than that. "You're suffering." The forest erupted into movement. A massive wolf burst from the tree line, muscles rippling beneath silver fur as it charged toward the cabin. Iris should have screamed, should have run. Instead, she found herself moving toward the back door, her hand reaching for the deadbolt with the certainty of someone sleepwalking. "Don't!" A voice crashed through her mind like a physical force. Gravel and thunder and wounded pride all at once. "Iris, do not!" She froze. How did he know her name? The wolf skidded to a halt at the edge of her porch, its massive head level with the railing. Up close, in the pale starlight, she could see the extent of its power, the sheer, devastating physicality of it. A creature like this shouldn't exist in the modern world. It belonged to older times, wilder times, when magic still ran freely through the mountains. Its golden eyes locked with hers, and she felt the pull again, that magnetism that transcended logic and safety. It was her heartbeat. It was breathing. It was the reason she'd walked away from her entire life in a single, impulsive moment. "Don't what?" she asked softly. "Don't come closer? Don't acknowledge that you've been watching me? Don't—" Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Don't feel this?" The wolf's breathing became ragged. A low sound rumbled from its chest, something between a growl and a whimper, and the raw need in that sound made her knees weak. "I can't protect you if I'm near you," the voice in her mind said. It was clearer now, almost corporeal, like he was speaking directly into the chambers of her heart. "The curse doesn't allow it. Every moment I'm close to you, I'm putting you in danger. When you touch me, when you're near me, it spreads, it corrupts, it kills." "Then why come here?" she demanded. "Why watch me? Why leave that deer and the locket and—" "Because I'm not strong enough to stay away." The confession seemed to shatter something in him. The wolf's legs trembled, and for a moment Iris saw the man beneath the fur, ancient and powerful and utterly, devastatingly broken. "I felt you before I ever saw you. The bond called to me across miles, pulled at every cell in my body, and I came because the alternative was death. Slow death, the kind that never ends." Iris's hand moved to the doorknob before she could think better of it. "No." The word was sharp, a whip crack of command. "You will not come outside. You will not touch me. If you value your life, Iris, you will go back to bed and lock every door between us." "Tell me," she said instead, ignoring the command. Tell me what you are. Tell me about the locket. Tell me about the bloodline and the prophecy and— My name is Alaric. The wolf's massive head lowered, resting against the porch railing, as if the weight of his own existence had become too much to bear. And I am the reason people die. The words hung in the cold mountain air between them, heavy with truth. Around them, the forest seemed to deepen, the darkness becoming more absolute, the silence more profound. Even the wind held its breath. "Tell me everything," Iris whispered. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of his breathing, harsh and controlled, the breathing of a creature at war with itself. Then, finally, the voice returned, and this time it carried the weight of centuries. "My bloodline has been cursed for generations. Each alpha born into my family line carries it differently. Some go mad, some become monsters, some simply wither from the inside out. My gift is worse. I don't just carry the curse, I spread it. Anyone I bond with, anyone I allow close enough to touch my soul, they become infected. They sicken. They die." Iris's hand tightened on the locket. The woman in the picture. My sister. The grief in his voice was almost unbearable. Bonded to me when I was too young to understand what I was, too foolish to fight it. She lasted 3 years before the corruption took her completely. I watched her fade, watched the light leave her eyes, and I was powerless to stop it. "You're saying—" "I'm saying that you carry bloodline magic, Iris. Old magic. The kind that's been sleeping in your family line for generations, waiting to awaken. The locket was your mother's. She was one of our kind, before she hid herself in the human world, before she tried to bury what she was. And you—" The wolf's golden eyes burned with something that looked like anguish. "You're the prophecy, an omega born of alpha blood. You're the only thing that could potentially break the curse. And that's why you came. That's why I came," he confirmed. "But you have to understand, I can't be what you need me to be. I can't protect you the way the bond demands. I can only hurt you. I can only destroy you. The moment you accept the connection between us, the corruption begins." Iris opened the back door. The wind hit her like a physical force, carrying the scent of pine and wild things, and a darkness so ancient it predated civilization. The silver locket burned hot against her skin. "Iris, if you were really dangerous to me," she said quietly, "you wouldn't be out there. You'd be in here. You'd have taken what the bond demands, and you wouldn't care about my safety or my choice. But you do care. Which means— Which means I'm a fool," he finished, his voice breaking. "A fool for hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could be something other than a plague." She took a step onto the porch. The wolf scrambled backward, putting distance between them, and she felt his terror as clearly as if it were her own. Not fear of her, fear for her. "Then help me understand," Iris said. "Help me understand what I am. Help me understand the curse. And maybe—" She paused, her voice dropping to something fierce and certain. "Maybe together we find a way to break it." In the darkness, the wolf's golden eyes blazed with something that looked like hope and doom in equal measure. "Tomorrow," she said. "Come back tomorrow, in the daylight, and we'll begin." The wolf turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving only the imprint of massive paws in the frost and the echo of a howl that sounded like a prayer. Iris stood alone on the porch, the locket burning against her heart, and felt the threads of her old life snap away one by one. There was no going back now. Iris didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table as the sky moved from black to deep indigo to that peculiar gray-blue of pre-dawn, nursing cold coffee and watching the forest edge where Alaric had disappeared. The locket lay open beside her laptop, the woman's face, her mother's face, staring up at her with an expression caught somewhere between defiance and sorrow. Her mother had been Pack, had bonded with a human man, buried her magic, and given birth to a daughter who'd inherited gifts she was never trained to understand. The thought should have been shocking. Instead, it felt like finally grasping a truth she'd always known was there, lurking just beyond the edge of memory. The search results on her laptop had evolved overnight. She'd found older texts now, genuine folklore archives from universities, anthropological papers tucked into obscure journals, accounts of Eastern European packs written in careful academic language that somehow made the impossible sound scholarly and real. Alphas and omegas, bloodline magic, curses that ran through families like poison in the veins. One paper mentioned the prophecy directly. In texts dating to the 12th century, there are references to an omega born of alpha bloodline, gifted with the ability to transmute rather than absorb dark magic. Such an individual, if properly bonded to a cursed alpha, could theoretically break generational curses through soul-level connection. Theoretically. As if breaking ancient curses was a neat academic proposition and not a terrifying reality unfolding in her cabin. At 9 a.m., there was a knock on the door. Iris's pulse jumped to her throat. She hadn't been expecting him to come as a human. Some part of her had assumed he would arrive in wolf form, that the separation between his two natures would provide some kind of buffer. She'd assumed wrong. When she opened the door, the man standing on her porch stole her breath entirely. He was tall, devastatingly tall, with the kind of presence that made the entire porch seem smaller, the mountains beyond seem less vast. His dark hair was wet, as if he'd come from water, and it fell in near black strands to his shoulders. But it was his eyes that captured her completely, that same burning gold she'd seen in the wolf, now set in a face that was all harsh angles and ancient sorrow. He wore dark jeans and a black sweater that couldn't quite hide the breadth of his shoulders, the lean muscle of a predator in human form. Everything about him radiated danger. Everything about him screamed that she should be afraid. Instead, Iris felt that pull intensify to something almost painful. "You came," she said. "I shouldn't have." His voice was exactly as she'd heard it in her mind, gravel and thunder, but filtered through human vocal cords, it carried an accent she couldn't quite place. Eastern European, maybe. Ancient. "Every moment I'm here, the risk to you increases." "Then why come at all?" Alaric's jaw clenched. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and she could see the tension in his knuckles, the way his shoulders were pulled tight, as if he was holding himself back with every ounce of will he possessed. "Because staying away was killing me faster than the curse ever could." The confession hung between them, raw and unguarded. Iris stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in, before someone sees you." He hesitated on the threshold as if it were a chasm, as if crossing it meant accepting something irreversible. Then, with visible effort, he stepped inside, and the cabin suddenly felt too small, too warm, too saturated with the scent of wild things and rain and something uniquely him, something that made her skin prickle with primal recognition. "How long have you been cursed?" she asked, moving to the kitchen. "Centuries." He said it the way someone might say decades, without inflection, as if time had lost meaning somewhere in the blur of suffering. My bloodline was cursed in the 14th century by a witch we wronged. An alpha took her daughter without consent, bonded her against her will. When he tried to force the mate bond into submission, she called down a curse. Any alpha of our line would spread corruption to anyone they bonded with. The witch wanted us to suffer the way her daughter suffered, aware of our mates, connected to them, but unable to protect them from the very thing we were. Iris poured him coffee even though she wasn't sure if he could drink it. Wasn't sure what rules applied to cursed werewolf alphas. 7 generations? 18, he corrected quietly. 18 alphas have risen and fallen. 18 have watched the people they loved sicken and die. And 18 times, we've been unable to break the curse because every method we tried required something we couldn't give. Genuine, willing bonding without protection. We tried to bond and shield. We tried to bond without touching souls. Nothing worked. The curse is too deep, too rooted in the original sin. She set the coffee in front of him. He stared at it as if it were a test. Why tell me this? Because you need to understand what you're offering to help with. His golden eyes met hers, and the intensity of that gaze made her breath catch. Breaking a curse of this magnitude requires sacrifice. It requires surrender. It requires a mate bond so complete that 2 people essentially become one soul in 2 bodies. And it requires an Omega who is willing to take on the corruption herself, to absorb it through the bond and transform it from the inside out. You're describing something that could kill me. Yes. The word was stark, unflinching, honest in a way that was almost cruel. Iris sat across from him, the kitchen table between them like a barrier neither of them dared breach. And if I refused? If I turned you away and locked all the doors, what would happen? I would leave. He finally lifted the coffee cup, took a sip as if testing whether his human form still remembered how. I would spend the next century waiting for another Omega prophecy to be born, hoping that one would be less brave than you. Or I would go feral. Let the curse consume me entirely and become the monster everyone already thinks I am. That's not a choice, Iris said softly. That's not really a choice at all. No. His hands were trembling now, barely perceptible. It's not. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the mountains held their breath. The forest pressed close to the cabin windows, watching. Tell me about the bond, Iris said. Not the curse. The bond itself. What does it feel like? Alaric set the coffee cup down with careful precision, as if controlling even that small movement required immense concentration. It's like being split open. It's like someone reached into your chest and tied a knot around your heart. And now every breath you take reminds you that you're tethered to another soul. It's the most exquisite agony and the deepest peace, existing in the same moment. Have you felt it? With me? Since the moment you walked into the forest. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Since the moment your mother's blood called to mine across time and distance. But feeling it and acting on it are 2 different things. I've spent the last 70 years alone specifically so I wouldn't have to. He cut himself off abruptly. Iris leaned forward. 70 years? Alaric's expression darkened. I'm 342 years old, Iris. I've lived long enough to know exactly what I'm capable of destroying, and the older I get, the more powerful the curse becomes. By now, bonding with me would mean extinction, she finished, not a question. Extinction, he confirmed. But even as he said it, Even as his face was carved with the weight of impossible choices and ancient suffering, his hand moved across the table toward hers. It stopped inches away, trembling with the effort of restraint. "Then we'd better find another way," Iris said, and closed the distance. The moment her skin touched his, the world exploded into sensation, into pain and light and a connection so profound it felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. The locket burned against her chest. The mountains seemed to scream. And in the gold of Alaric's eyes, she saw not a curse or a death sentence. She saw the beginning of something neither of them could stop. The pain started 3 hours after they touched. Iris didn't recognize it at first. She'd retreated to her bedroom after Alaric left. He'd torn himself away from her with visible agony, stumbling backward as if she'd burned him. And maybe she had. The moment his skin left hers, she felt the absence like a cavity in her chest. But it was manageable. It was the kind of longing that felt almost poetic. Then came the fever. It started in her fingers and spread upward like roots of ice through her veins. By the time she realized what was happening, her entire right hand had turned a sickly gray blue, the skin becoming translucent, the veins beneath visible and dark, as if pumped with ink. It hurt in a way that transcended physical pain, a corruption that felt like her cells were rebelling, turning on themselves. She called Alaric's name before she could think better of it, and the connection between them, that new, terrifying bond, carried her voice directly into his mind like a psychic scream. He arrived at the cabin in wolf form, bursting through the back door with such violence that the frame splintered. She was upstairs, collapsed on the bathroom floor, her entire arm now pulsing with that sickly discoloration, and the moment he saw her, the wolf howled, a sound of such anguished fury that the windows rattled in their frames. Then he was human again, kneeling beside her, and his hands hovered over her corrupted arm without touching, as if proximity itself was dangerous. His face was a mask of horror and self-recrimination. "I knew this would happen," he whispered. "God, Iris, I knew. Even one moment of contact, and the curse starts to—" "It's spreading," she gasped. The corruption was moving past her shoulder now, creeping across her collarbone. "How long do I have before—" "Don't," his voice cracked. "Don't finish that sentence." She grabbed his jaw with her unaffected hand, forcing him to look at her. "Tell me. I need to know what I'm facing." Alaric's golden eyes were wild, desperate. "Days. Maybe a week before it reaches your heart. Once it does," he swallowed hard. "Once it does, the corruption will consume you from the inside. You'll sicken. You'll suffer. And there's nothing I can do to stop it, because the only cure is the complete bond, and the complete bond requires—" "Acceptance," she finished. "Soul-level surrender. You told me." "I told you the theory," he said bitterly. "What I didn't tell you is that theory has never been tested. No Omega has ever survived the process. The corruption is too aggressive, too intelligent. It feeds on the bonded connection itself. The more you open yourself to me, the faster it spreads." Iris felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the curse. "So this was a trap. You knew touching me would poison me, and you let me do it anyway." "I didn't let you." He stood abruptly, pacing the bathroom like a caged predator. "You touched me. I fought it. I warned you." "You touched back." Her voice was quiet, deadly. "You moved your hand across that table. You chose to close the distance. And you absolutely knew, what would happen." Alaric stopped moving. In the bathroom mirror, she could see his reflection, and the anguish carved into his features was almost inhuman. Yes, he said finally. I knew. And I did it anyway because the alternative was living another 100 years in the dark, alone, waiting for a cure that would never come. Because you were real, and you were here, and for 3 seconds, I allowed myself to want something other than death. The confession hung between them, brutal and honest. Iris looked down at her arm. The corruption had reached her elbow now, the gray-blue spreading like frostbite, and with it came a profound exhaustion that made thinking difficult. "Help me to the bedroom," she said. "And then you need to leave." "Absolutely not. If being near you accelerates the corruption, then the best thing you can do for me is distance." She stood on shaky legs, and Alaric caught her instinctively, his arms around her waist, and she felt the curse leap with vindication at the contact. Spreading faster, greedier, she pushed away from him. "See? We can't touch. We can't be close. So you need to go. Now." "I'm not abandoning you. You're not abandoning me." She moved toward the hallway, toward her bedroom. "You're protecting me. Isn't that what you wanted? What you've been trying to do since you found me?" Alaric followed her, his presence a burning weight at her back. She could feel the conflict radiating off him, the war between his protective instincts and his horror at what his mere existence was doing to her. It was a fight she couldn't help him win. She collapsed onto the bed, and he stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light, looking every inch the ancient predator he was, wounded, desperate, trapped by his own nature. "There has to be a way to stop this," he said. "The prophecy texts, the lore, there has to be something." "There is," Iris said quietly, "but you're not going to like it." He moved closer, and she held up her corrupted hand in warning. He stopped, respecting the boundary even though it clearly cost him. "The texts mention a ritual," she continued, "an old one, a way to bind two souls together in the space between life and death, where the corruption can be faced directly. It's described as—" She paused, searching for the right words. "A shared death dream. A journey into the in-between where the curse originated, where its roots run deepest." "Absolutely not. If you go into that kind of magic while you're already infected—" "I'll probably die," she finished. "I know. But staying here, letting the corruption spread, delaying the inevitable, that's a slower death, and it's one where I have no control. At least in the ritual, there's a chance. Not for me necessarily, but for us. For breaking the curse." Alaric's hands clenched into fists. "I won't risk you." "You don't have a choice." Iris met his eyes across the space between them, and she saw the moment he understood that she meant it. "I'm an adult. I came here knowing the risks. And the moment you touched me, the moment you let me touch you, you made the choice for both of us. Now we have to live with it." "By dying?" "By fighting," she corrected. "By going into the dark, together, and confronting the thing that's been poisoning your bloodline for 7 centuries. By doing what no one else has been willing to do, risk everything for a cure that might not exist." The silence in the bedroom was absolute. Outside, the mountains held their breath. The forest pressed close, listening. Finally, Alaric spoke, and his voice was stripped of everything except raw truth. "If you die, I follow. The bond won't allow anything else, you understand that? If you go into that ritual and don't come back, you're not just ending your life, you're ending mine." "Then we both have to come back," Iris said simply. But even as she said it, even as the locket burned hot against her skin and the corruption crept steadily up her arm, she wondered if anything so broken could ever truly be repaired. wondered if some curses ran too deep, wondered if choosing him, choosing this ritual, was the bravest thing she'd ever done, or the most foolish. Outside, in the darkening forest, something ancient and watching began to move. By dawn, the corruption had reached her heart. Iris could feel it, a slow, suffocating pressure behind her ribs, as if her own organ had become a fist that refused to unclench. Each breath was harder than the last. Her vision had started to blur at the edges, and the fever that had begun as ice fire in her veins now felt like being burned from the inside out. Alaric hadn't left. He'd positioned himself in the chair beside her bed, far enough away to minimize the corruption's spread, but close enough that she could feel his presence like a tether keeping her tethered to the living world. They hadn't spoken in hours. There was nothing left to say. The ritual was their only option, and performing it would require entering the in-between space where curses lived, a place where rules didn't apply, and death was as real as breathing. "The grimoire," Iris whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it still in your pack?" Alaric's head lifted from where it had been resting against the chair back. His face was haggard, aged by guilt and desperation in a way that made him look less like a god, and more like a ghost haunting his own existence. "The original grimoire that documented the curse ritual. Yes. It's been kept by my bloodline for 4 centuries. But Iris, the spell requires—" "I know what it requires," she cut him off. "Blood. Moonlight. A space between one world and another. It requires your willing surrender to me, a complete opening of your soul to mine, with no walls, no defenses, no protection. If the ritual fails, if the curse is too strong, you won't just die. You'll be conscious for it. You'll feel yourself being consumed from the inside, and you won't be able to scream because your voice will belong to the darkness." "Then it's a good thing we're not going to fail." She managed a smile, though it felt like glass breaking across her face. "Besides, I'm already being consumed. At least this way, I'm choosing the method." Alaric stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. He moved to the window, his hands gripping the frame hard enough to crack the wood. "There's something else you need to know. Something I should have told you days ago." The tone of his voice made Iris's already compromised heart skip a beat. "What?" "I didn't come to your cabin by accident. I didn't find you by chance." He kept his back to her, staring out into the forest like it held answers to questions he'd never dared ask. 3 months ago, the oracle of my pack sensed a disturbance in the bloodline magic, an Omega awakening. She told the council that the prophecy was beginning, that I had to find you, protect you, bring you into the fold before your gifts manifested fully. "So you were sent." "I was sent," he confirmed quietly, "by the pack elders, by the council, by duty and obligation and centuries of hope that finally, there would be an Omega born with the power to break the curse. I came hunting for a solution to a 700-year-old problem, and instead, I found—" He turned to face her, and his golden eyes were shattered with emotion. "I found you." Iris wanted to be angry, wanted to feel betrayed, but she was too tired, too sick, too close to understanding that none of it mattered anymore. "Did you develop feelings for me? Or was that part of the plan too?" "The bond is real," he said fiercely. "Everything I feel for you is real. But yes, initially, I came because the pack sent me. Because they needed you. Because they believed you could save us all. And now? Now I'd burn the entire pack to the ground to keep you alive." His voice was absolute. "The council be damned. The prophecy be damned. If there was any way to break this curse without putting you in danger, I would take it in a heartbeat. A sound interrupted them, a howl that echoed through the mountains with a quality that made Iris's corrupted blood freeze in her veins. It wasn't Alaric's howl. It was something else. Something wrong. Alaric's entire body went rigid. His eyes shifted to pure wolf gold, and his hands curled into claws. They're here. The pack? No. He moved to the window, his gaze sharp as a predator's. Rogues, a faction that broke from the council centuries ago. They believe the curse is a punishment we deserve, that breaking it would be an abomination against the natural order. They've been hunting for you as hard as the council has been protecting you. If they find you before the ritual, if they capture you. The window exploded inward as a massive dark shape crashed through it. Glass and frames scattered across the bedroom, and Iris screamed as a second wolf, this one coal-black and scarred with ritual markings, landed in a crouch between her and Alaric. More howls echoed from outside. Multiple wolves, maybe a dozen. "Run," Alaric said to her, even as he shifted into his wolf form, his massive silver body placing itself between the rogue and the bed. "Out the back, down to the creek. Follow it north until you hit the old forest road. There's a sanctuary lodge there." "I'm not leaving you. You have to." His voice crashed through her mind with the force of an alpha command. "The ritual requires both of us alive. If I fall here, we both die. So you run, and I'll hold them off, and we meet at the sanctuary." The rogue black wolf snarled, and the fight erupted with terrible speed. Iris didn't think. She moved on instinct, pulling herself from the bed despite the way the world tilted and spun, despite the corruption eating at her from the inside. She stumbled toward the door as Alaric and the black wolf collided in a tangle of fur and claws and blood. More rogues were pouring into the cabin from the shattered window. She could hear them on the stairs, sense the predatory hunger that radiated from them. They wanted her alive, which meant they wouldn't attack directly, but they would herd her, corner her, force her into situations where escape was impossible. She made it to the hallway. The locket burned against her skin, and suddenly she understood. The locket wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a conduit. It was her mother's magic, dormant and waiting. She wrapped her fingers around it, and something ancient and powerful stirred behind her sternum, pushing back against the corruption, fighting for space in her own body. A rogue wolf lunged from the stairwell, and Iris didn't think about consequences. She didn't think about the magic she'd never been trained to use. She simply felt the wolf's trajectory, understood the geometry of its attack, and twisted. The locket flared with silver light, and the wolf yelped and recoiled, its fur smoking where the light had touched it. They were afraid of her. The rogues were actually afraid. She ran. Down the back stairs, through the kitchen, out the door into the freezing mountain air. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of battle. Alaric's roar, the snarls of the rogues, the crash of her cabin being torn to pieces. The forest seemed to part for her as she ran, the trees guiding her toward the creek, toward the north path, toward survival. But with each step, the corruption clawed deeper. Her vision swam. Her lungs felt like they were filling with concrete. How much longer did she have? Hours? Minutes? The sanctuary lodge appeared through the fog, an old structure of dark wood and ancient stone, half hidden by centuries of overgrowth. Iris collapsed against its door, gasping, and it swung open as if responding to her desperate need. Inside was darkness. Inside was shelter. Inside was the grimoire, laid out on an altar as if someone had been waiting for her all along. Behind her, the forest erupted into chaos as Alaric, still fighting, still bleeding, burst from the trees with 3 rogue wolves in pursuit. The door slammed shut behind them both, and in the sanctuary's sacred darkness, a countdown began. The sanctuary was older than time. That was Iris's first thought as her eyes adjusted to the dimness. The walls weren't just stone, they were something else, something that hummed with a frequency that made her teeth ache. Runes covered every surface, carved so deeply that they seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once, and in the center of the chamber, on an altar of black marble, lay the grimoire. Alaric collapsed beside her, his human form bleeding from a dozen wounds, his breathing ragged. One of the rogue attacks had caught him across the ribs, and she could see the corruption, his own curse, bleeding from the wound like ink in water. He was infected by proximity to her, she realized. Even as his own curse was killing her, hers was beginning to poison him. "We're trapped," he said between gasps. "The sanctuary is sealed. No one can enter or leave until the ritual is complete." "How is that helpful?" Iris asked. But even as she spoke, she understood. The sanctuary wasn't a prison. It was a crucible. A space where external forces couldn't interfere, where the only thing that mattered was what existed between the two of them. She moved to the grimoire, her corrupted hand shaking as she opened it. The pages were impossibly old, written in a language that should have been indecipherable, and yet somehow, as she looked at each word, the meaning bloomed directly into her mind like flowers opening to sunlight. The locket translated it, or her blood did, or some part of her that had always been pack, always been magic, recognized the script of her own kind. "The curse began with consent," she read aloud, her voice strange in her own ears. "A willing binding. An alpha and an omega, matched by prophecy, blood sworn in the old way before the church's laws forbade it." Alaric moved beside her, close enough that she could feel his heat, but not touch. "That's not how the history records it. The witch—" "There was no witch," Iris said. The words came from the grimoire, from the locket, from somewhere deep in her own awakening magic. "There was only a woman who loved an alpha so much that she agreed to tie herself to his bloodline forever. She knew about the darkness in his family, knew that the curse ran through his veins like poison, and she took it on willingly, believing that love could transform it, believing that her omega magic could balance his alpha shadow." She turned the page. More words bloomed, more understanding crystallized. "Her name was Katerina," Iris whispered. "And she wasn't cursed by anyone. She was broken by him. The Alpha, your ancestor. He couldn't accept that her magic was different from his. Couldn't accept that she was strong enough to stand beside him instead of beneath him. He tried to dominate the bond, tried to make her submit to his will completely. And when she refused, when she fought back and proved that her omega power was equal to his alpha force, he couldn't bear it. He called it a curse, called her powerful magic an abomination, and the other alphas believed him because they feared what an omega could do if she was truly equal. The grimoire fell from her hands as the truth of it hit her like a physical blow. "So, it's not a curse at all," Alaric said slowly. His voice was hollow, devastated. "It's a lie. A story we've been telling ourselves for 700 years. The curse is just what we created because we couldn't accept that omega magic is as powerful, more powerful, than our own." "Not just omega magic," Iris said, looking at him. "Partnership. Actual, genuine equality between two souls. Your bloodline has been taught that such a thing is weakness. That an alpha must dominate completely, or he destroys everyone around him. And so you've built a curse from that belief. You've made it real through generations of acceptance." Alaric stood abruptly, moving away from her as if her words had physical force. That's impossible. The deaths, my sister, hundreds of mates, all dead. Died because the curse was real enough, Iris said quietly. Belief shapes magic, Alaric. When you bonded with someone while believing you would poison them, you did poison them. Not because it was inevitable, because you expected it, because you feared it. Because every alpha before you had been taught that equality between alpha and omega was impossible. She moved to the altar and found what she'd been searching for. A second grimoire, bound in leather that was unmistakably from this century. Her mother's handwriting was inside. Entries dated from 28 years ago, right around when Iris was born. I have bonded with a human man, the first entry read. Against all council law, against all tradition. I am an Omega born of Alpha bloodline, and I have chosen to bond with someone who has no wolf in him at all. The council says it will end in death. But I believe, I know, that the curse is a story we tell ourselves about what we're allowed to be. I am pregnant. My daughter will be born into a world that doesn't know she's magic. That might be a mercy. Later entries documented her mother's struggle. The way the corruption had started when she'd tried to open herself to her human husband, and the way she'd stopped it by simply refusing to believe in it. By choosing, moment by moment, that the bond would not poison them. That love without domination was possible. I have found a way to slow the corruption, her mother had written, not through submission, not through separation, but through radical acceptance, through deciding that my power and his fragility can coexist. That strength is not about control. And then, in the final entry, dated just after Iris's birth, I have hidden what I am from my daughter because the world isn't ready for her. But the day will come when she awakens to her magic. The day will come when she meets an alpha who has been taught that he is a plague. And on that day, I pray she will have the courage to show him the truth, that the only curse that exists is the one he believes in. The only poison is the story we tell ourselves about what love should look like. Iris looked up from the grimoire to find Alaric staring at her with an expression of fragile, terrified hope. The ritual, he said hoarsely. It's not about me absorbing the curse, is it? It's not about you transmuting it. No, Iris said. She closed her mother's grimoire and felt something settle in her chest. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of healing. It's about us choosing to believe something different. It's about two people standing in a space between worlds and deciding together that the curse is a story, and stories can be rewritten. She pulled off the locket and set it on the altar beside the grimoires. My mother's magic, your bloodline's burden, both of them laid down, both of them let go. The sanctuary began to glow, not the harsh silver light of Iris's earlier magic, but something softer, something that sounded like breathing, like heartbeat, like two souls learning to synchronize. The runes on the walls began to sing, a frequency so old it predated language. Alaric moved toward her, and this time she didn't warn him away. Their hands met in the center of the altar, and where their skin touched, the corruption began to dissolve. Not because it was being fought or absorbed or transformed, but because neither of them was feeding it anymore. The ritual had begun, and everything they had learned, everything they had lost, everything they had almost destroyed each other to find, it was all leading to this moment, to the space between one belief and another, where two broken people could choose to become whole. The corruption didn't disappear, it transformed. As Alaric's hand covered hers on the altar, the gray-blue that had been eating away at Iris's arm shifted to silver, the same luminous silver as the locket, as his wolf form, as the ancient magic that ran through both their bloodlines. It didn't hurt anymore. Instead, it felt like being remade at the cellular level, like every part of her that had been poisoned was being recalibrated, rewired, understood. Alaric gasped as the contact deepened. Through their joined hands, Iris felt the full weight of what he carried, not the curse itself, but the burden of believing the curse was real. 342 years of guilt, 18 generations of death he'd internalized as his personal responsibility. The accumulated grief of watching people sicken, watching them suffer, believing it was his very nature that destroyed them. It was too much. It was unbearable. And yet, it was also beautiful in a terrible way. Because underneath all that grief was love. Desperate, aching, powerful love. The kind of love that had made him leave his pack, his territory, his entire world to find a stranger in the mountains. The kind of love that had made him stand alone against rogue wolves to protect her escape. The kind of love that had slowly, inexorably transformed from duty into something that transcended duty entirely. "I can feel what you feel," Iris whispered. "Then you know what I've done," Alaric said. His voice was breaking, and when she opened her eyes, she saw tears running down his face. "You know that even if the curse isn't real, the deaths were real. My sister was real. They suffered, and I let them because I was too weak to find another way." "You were taught," Iris said gently. "Taught by your entire culture, your entire bloodline, that the curse was inevitable. You weren't weak. You were imprisoned. That's a mercy I don't deserve." He pulled his hand away from hers, and the silver light immediately began to fade. He stood, pacing the sanctuary like a caged predator, his body vibrating with an emotion Iris didn't have a name for, grief and rage and self-loathing all twisted together. "I'm the alpha. I'm supposed to be strong enough to break free from false narratives. I'm supposed to be powerful enough to question the stories I've been told, and instead, I've been grinding my own bloodline beneath the weight of a lie." "Alaric, no." He held up his hand, not letting her approach. "You don't understand what you're asking me to do. You're asking me to forgive myself for centuries of harm. You're asking me to take on a new story just as readily as I accepted the old one. But what if this new story is just another kind of cage? What if I'm trading one lie for another?" The question hung between them, and Iris realized this was the real test. Not the ritual, not the corruption, not the rogue wolves battering against the sanctuary's barriers. This was the moment where Alaric had to choose whether he was willing to believe he could be something other than a plague. She stood and approached him despite his warning gesture, and when he tried to step away, she grabbed his face with both hands, the corrupted hand and the whole one, bringing both sides of herself to bear against his denial. "Feel me," she commanded. "Not my love, not my desire. Feel my certainty. Feel what I know, Alaric. Feel the truth of me." Their eyes locked. And suddenly they weren't in the sanctuary anymore. They were in the space between worlds, the liminal place where the ritual truly lived. Here, there were no lies, no narratives, no inherited trauma masquerading as destiny. There was only what was actually true. Iris showed him the moment she'd first seen the wolf watching her through the window. The instant she'd felt the connection, bone deep and primal. The choice she'd made to unlock the door, to risk infection, to accept the corruption because she believed, truly believed, that he was worth saving. Not because of prophecy, not because of duty, but because even before she'd known who he was, some part of her had recognized him as home. And underneath her certainty was something else, something she hadn't fully acknowledged Until this moment, terror. Terror that he would reject her. Terror that even now, even understanding the curse was false, he would choose safety over her. Terror that one person's refusal to believe could shatter everything they'd built in the last few days. She let him feel all of it, the wanting and the fear intertwined, inseparable. Alaric's hands shook as he pulled her close, and his forehead came down to rest against hers. "If I let myself believe this," he said, his voice barely audible, "if I let myself believe that I can be something other than destruction, and I fail, if I hurt you, if I become the curse anyway, then we face it together," Iris said simply. "Not as a plague and its victim, as two people who chose each other and everything that choice entails." "That's not fair," he said, and there was a sob underneath the words. "To ask you to trust me that much. To ask you to surrender that completely." "I'm not asking you," Iris replied. "I'm telling you what I've already decided. The locket is on the altar. The grimoires are open. The sanctuary is sealed. We're past the point of fair, Alaric. We're at the point of truth." He kissed her then, and it wasn't gentle. It was desperate and furious and utterly, completely honest. His hands tangled in her hair, pulled her closer, deeper, as if he could absorb her into himself through sheer force of wanting. And she let him, meeting him halfway, matching his intensity with her own. The silver light exploded outward from where they touched, not soft and transformative anymore, but violent with power. The runes on the walls shrieked in a frequency that should have shattered bone. The very foundations of the sanctuary seemed to scream in response. They broke apart, breathing hard, and Iris realized that the corruption was completely gone now. Her entire arm had returned to its normal pale human color. The gray-blue that had been eating her from the inside was no longer even a memory. Alaric looked down at his own skin and found the same thing. The curse marks that had existed since his birth, patterns of dark that existed beneath his surface, were fading. Not gone entirely, but receding, becoming less absolute, like a scar that would always exist but no longer defined him. "What did we just do?" he asked. "We stopped choosing the curse," Iris said. She felt different. Lighter in some ways, heavier in others, like she'd been carrying something her entire life and had finally set it down, only to discover that the weight had been part of her muscle structure. She would have to learn to move differently now, learn to live as someone who wasn't bracing against inherited pain. Outside the sanctuary, the howling suddenly intensified. The rogue wolves were ramming against the barriers with renewed fury, as if they could sense the change happening inside, as if they understood that something fundamental had shifted in the world's architecture. "They're breaking through," Alaric said, moving toward the grimoires. "The sanctuary won't hold much longer. We need to prepare for what comes next." But Iris wasn't afraid anymore. She'd spent the last week terrified of the curse, of the ritual, of opening herself completely to a man she barely knew. And yes, danger still existed outside these walls. Yes, the rogue wolves still hunted them. Yes, questions still remained about what it meant to break a 700-year-old curse, about how to convince an entire pack that their foundational narrative had been false. But standing in the silver light of the sanctuary, her hand clasped with Alaric's, she understood something her mother had tried to teach her through those hidden diary entries. Fear and courage were not opposites. They were dance partners. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was acknowledge them both and move forward anyway. "Then we face them," she said, echoing her own earlier words back to him. "Together." The sanctuary walls cracked. Light spilled through the fractures, not the gentle glow of the sanctuary, but the harsh reality of the mountain night beyond. In just a few moments, the barriers would fail completely. But Alaric was already pulling her toward the center of the altar, toward the space where the two grimoires lay open, where the locket still gleamed with her mother's love and his bloodline's burden. "The final trial," he said, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice carried no doubt. "Let them come. We're ready." The sanctuary exploded inward. Not metaphorically. The ancient stone walls literally shattered as a coordinated attack from a dozen rogue wolves hit the barrier simultaneously. Alaric moved in front of Iris instinctively, his body shifting mid-stride into his wolf form. Larger now, more powerful than before, the fading curse marks along his silver fur looking almost like battle scars from a war he'd already won. But Iris didn't cower behind him. She stepped forward, letting the locket fall from her fingers to rest against her chest, and felt her own magic respond. Not just the silver light anymore, but something deeper. Something that had been dormant in her bloodline since her mother walked away from the pack. The air around her began to shimmer with a different kind of power, one that was uniquely hers, uniquely Omega, and utterly undeniable. The lead rogue wolf, a massive beast with ritual scars carved deep into its flesh, skidded to a halt just inside the sanctuary's threshold. Its eyes, a murky gray that suggested a soul long corrupted by the rogue faction's ideology, fixed on Iris with something between hunger and hatred. "The Omega," it snarled through the pack's telepathic bond. "She walks willingly at the cursed Alpha's side. The prophecy has poisoned her mind." "I haven't been poisoned," Iris said aloud, her voice steady. "I've been awakened." The rogue lunged. Alaric intercepted it mid-air, and the two wolves collided in a tangle of fur and fangs. But something was different in this fight. Alaric moved with a fluidity he hadn't possessed before, his strikes precise and purposeful rather than desperate. He was no longer fighting to survive or to protect. He was fighting with the certainty of someone who finally believed he deserved to win. More rogues poured through the fractured walls, and Iris realized that the sanctuary was no longer functioning as a barrier. The ritual space had been consumed by the battle, transformed into a liminal ground where magic and physicality collided with equal force. She felt Alaric's presence in her mind, not demanding, but offering, asking permission. And she gave it, dropping every wall she'd ever built, letting him in completely. Their consciousness merged until they were no longer two people in one body, but one soul experiencing reality through dual perspectives. "Together," she said through the bond. "Together," he confirmed. Alaric fought with half his attention in his own body and half merged with hers. It was impossible. Should have been impossible, but Iris felt no contradiction. Instead, it was like learning to move limbs she'd never known she had. She could see through his eyes even as she stood stationary, could feel the ground through his paws, even as her feet remained on the ancient stone. When a rogue wolf lunged at her from the left, she already knew it was coming because Alaric had seen it first. She sidestepped with a grace that surprised her, and as the wolf passed, the silver light erupted from her palms, not to hurt, but to bind. Threads of luminous energy wrapped around the rogue's limbs, and suddenly it found itself unable to move, caught in the very magic it had come to destroy. Another rogue attacked, then another. The sanctuary became a maelstrom of violence and light, and through it all, Iris and Alaric moved as a single entity. When he needed her strength, she gave it. When she needed his combat experience, he guided her through the patterns of pack warfare. But there was a cost. With each act of magic, with each moment they remained fully merged, the corruption that had transformed into silver began to spread again, not destructive now, but invasive. It wasn't poisoning them, it was integrating them, making them literally inseparable at the magical level. This is the bond, Alaric said through their merged consciousness. The real bond, not love or attraction. Existence as a unified consciousness in dual form. Is this reversible? Iris asked. No, he said simply. This is what my ancestors feared. This is what they called the curse. Two souls becoming so intertwined that individual choice becomes impossible. Iris felt the weight of that truth but didn't hesitate. Then we choose it together. The final rogue, the scarred leader, rose to its full height above the fallen bodies of its pack. They'd fought their way through a dozen attackers, and now only this one remained. The corruption in this wolf's eyes was absolute, generations deep, a darkness that had consumed whatever individual identity it might have once possessed. It howled, and Iris felt the despair in that sound. Not despair at losing, but despair at being what it was, a creature so devoted to an ideology that had no room for individual thought, individual choice, individual hope. Let me show you, Iris said, and before Alaric could protest, she stepped forward and opened herself completely to the rogue. Not as a weapon, as a mirror. She let the rogue see what she and Alaric had discovered in the sanctuary, that the curse was a story, that suffering was a choice, that power didn't require domination. She let it feel the bond between them, not a prison, but a choice made moment by moment. She let it understand that unity didn't erase individuality, it elevated it. The rogue wolf staggered backward. For a moment, Iris thought it might turn and flee, but instead, it began to shift, the transformation happening in the middle of the sanctuary, bones cracking and reforming. The ritual scars becoming less defined as the wolf's consciousness reasserted itself. When the transformation was complete, a man knelt in the center of the sanctuary floor. His face was ancient, carved by centuries of believing in a lie. But his eyes held something that hadn't been there before. A question. Is it really possible? He asked, his voice raw from disuse. Could we truly choose something different? Yes, Iris said simply. But only if you let the old stories die. Only if you're willing to believe that your pack has been wrong for 700 years. That takes more courage than fighting ever required. The man looked at Alaric, and Iris felt a moment of tension through their bond. These two represented opposite sides of an ancient conflict, the Council Alpha and the rogue faction leader, face to face in the ruins of the sanctuary. But Alaric lowered his head in a gesture that was both submission and respect. I was taught the same lies you were, he said to the rogue. I believe them for longer than you've been alive. If there's any hope for the pack to change, it starts with both of us choosing to be different. The rogue closed his eyes, and Iris felt something shift in the spiritual landscape. It was subtle, but absolute, like a fundamental rule of the world had been rewritten. The rogue faction's darkness didn't disappear, but it lost its absolute power. It became a choice rather than an inevitability. The council will never accept this, the rogue said finally. They'll see it as heresy. They'll try to destroy you both. Then we'll face them, Iris said. But first, we have to finish what we started. The ritual space around them was cooling now, the magical intensity fading as the battle concluded. The sanctuary was no longer sealed. The boundaries between worlds were returning to their proper places. And in the distance, Iris could sense other wolves approaching, pack members, council members, drawn by the chaos and the spike of magical energy. But before they arrived, before the next phase of conflict began, Iris and Alaric had one final thing to do. They returned to the altar, where the grimoires still lay open, where the locket still gleamed with transformed power. The rogue leader watched from a distance, no longer an antagonist, but an observer, a witness to what came next. Alaric took her hand one final time, and as their fingers intertwined, the bond reached its completion. Not an explosion this time, but a settling, like two pieces of a puzzle finding their exact fit. The silver light that had been spreading through their connection became still, integrated, a permanent part of their shared existence. They were no longer two people bound by prophecy or curse. They were one consciousness in two forms, forever intertwined, forever choosing each other. And the world, watching from beyond the sanctuary, would have to learn to accept what they had become. The world had stopped making sense. That was Iris's first coherent thought as she lay in Alaric's arms on the sanctuary floor, their bodies pressed together, their breathing synchronized to a rhythm that felt less like two people respiring and more like a single organism that happened to occupy two forms. She could feel his heartbeat through her back, but it wasn't distinct from hers anymore. Both were beating at the same cadence, the same intensity, as if his heart had learned to match the tempo of hers. "Are you frightened?" Alaric asked softly. His voice came from beside her ear, but she also heard it, directly in her mind, a thought that belonged to both of them simultaneously. The distinction between internal and external communication had become almost meaningless. "No," Iris said, and it was true. What she felt was beyond fear. It was a kind of peaceful dissolution of the boundaries that had always defined her as a separate person. "But I don't understand how this is supposed to work. How do two people exist as one and still be individuals?" Alaric's arms tightened around her, and she felt it. Not just the physical pressure, but the emotional intention behind it. Tenderness, protective instinct, a need to keep her safe that was inseparable from his own survival instinct, because her survival was his survival now. "I don't think we're supposed to," he said. "I think we're supposed to be something the pack has never allowed before, something they were too afraid to even imagine." She turned in his arms to face him, and the moment their eyes met, she understood what he meant. She could see into him now, not just his surface thoughts, but the deeper layers of his consciousness. She saw the boy he'd been, centuries ago, before the weight of the curse had calcified his heart. She saw the moment his sister had sickened, the precise instant when hope had transformed into despair. She saw every person he'd loved and lost, every guilt he'd carried, every moment he'd believed himself to be a plague. And he saw all of her, equally exposed. He saw her running from Boston, from her mother's buried magic, from a life that had never been hers. He saw the moment she'd truly decided to accept the bond, not in the kitchen, but years earlier, in her childhood, when she'd first sensed something wild and magical in the world, and chosen to believe in it rather than suppress it. He saw her mother's strength and courage reflected in her own choices. "We're not one person," Iris said, understanding crystallizing. "We're two people who chose to stop pretending we were separate. There's a difference." "Explain it to me," Alaric whispered, and the vulnerability in those 3 words was absolute. She brought her hand up to his face, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingers. "You are still you. I am still me. But we're also both of us, together, simultaneously. You don't lose yourself in this bond. You find another version of yourself reflected back." And that version is real. That version has always existed. We just finally made it visible. Alaric closed his eyes, and she felt the cascade of emotion move through him. Acceptance and wonder, and a grief that was finally, peacefully transforming into something else. Gratitude. Understanding. The strange, bittersweet knowledge that all his suffering had led to this moment. And in that moment, the suffering finally made sense because it had brought him here, to her, to this threshold where an entirely different kind of existence became possible. "My sister," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "In this consciousness we share, can I feel her? Can I understand what happened to her?" Iris opened herself fully, diving deeper into the unified space between them, and suddenly she could feel it. Traces of the bonded mates he'd lost, not as ghosts, but as echoes. The corruption hadn't destroyed them, it had transformed them. They existed in a kind of liminal space, neither living nor dead, caught in the moment when they'd finally understood the curse was real because they'd been taught it was real. "She's not gone," Iris said softly. "None of them are gone. They exist in the space between, and now that we understand the curse was a lie, that space has changed. They can feel it. They can feel you, finally, understanding the truth." Through the bond, Iris sensed something like a collective exhalation, a release of pressure from spirits that had been trapped in anguish for centuries. The women and men who had bonded with Alaric's bloodline, who had sickened and died believing the poison was inevitable, they were finally understanding that their deaths hadn't been written into fate. They had been choices made by a system that refused to imagine alternatives. "I want to bring them back," Alaric said immediately, but Iris gently shook her head. "We can't," she said. "The liminal space isn't a place people return from. But we can honor them. We can rebuild the pack around the truth they died protecting. We can create a world where what happened to them never happens again." Alaric pulled her closer, and they lay together in the ruins of the sanctuary as the first light of dawn began to filter through the broken walls. Outside, she could sense the pack approaching, both council members and those who'd followed the rogue leader. They were coming to witness, to judge, to decide whether Iris and Alaric's transformation was salvation or abomination. But in this moment, none of that mattered. In this moment, there was only the space between two souls who had chosen to stop being separate, to stop fighting against connection, to stop believing that unity required domination. "What happens when they get here?" Alaric asked. "We tell them the truth," Iris said. "We show them what we've become. And we give them the choice my mother never had, to accept it or reject it, but to do so knowing what they're rejecting, knowing that Omega and Alpha can be equal, knowing that the curse was always a story, and stories can be rewritten." She felt Alaric's fear spike through the bond, not of the pack's judgment, but of the idea that she might be wrong. That the pack might reject them so thoroughly that they'd have to leave their bloodline, their territory, their entire world behind. "If that happens," Iris said, understanding his fear because it was now her fear too, "we build something new. We find other Omegas who've been hidden, other Alphas who've questioned the narrative. We create a pack that doesn't require one person to be less than for another to be whole." "You'd do that?" he asked. "Give up everything?" "I gave up everything the moment I left Boston," she said softly. "I just didn't realize what I was choosing to gain. But now I understand. I'm not giving up anything. I'm finally, fully, becoming what I was always meant to be." She felt the moment he truly accepted it, not intellectually, but spiritually. The last resistance in him dissolved like morning mist, and what remained was pure, uncomplicated love. Not the desperate, fearful love he'd felt before, but something mature and grounded. A love that didn't need to protect because it trusted in her strength. A love that didn't need to control because it celebrated her autonomy. They remained on the sanctuary floor as the sun rose higher, as the pack members began to gather outside the broken walls, as the world prepared for a confrontation that would either transform their entire civilization or destroy them trying. But inside the sanctuary, in the space where two souls had learned to exist as one, there was only peace. Only the quiet knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. Not as fractured pieces held together by desperation, but as a unified consciousness that had finally learned the truth, that the strongest bonds were not forged through control, but through the courageous decision to be fully, vulnerably, authentically seen, and to still choose each other. The pack filled the mountain clearing like a dark tide. They came in wolf form and human form both, alphas and omegas, council members and those who'd followed the rogue faction, warriors and healers and the old ones who remembered the prophecies written in blood and moonlight. They surrounded the sanctuary, not attacking but waiting, watching. The unified consciousness that was Iris and Alaric could feel their confusion, their fear, their desperate hope that somehow, some way, this impossible transformation meant salvation rather than heresy. Alaric emerged first, stepping through the shattered walls in human form. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and the curse marks that had once covered his entire body were now visible only as faint silver tracings, scars that would never fully fade, proof of what he'd endured, proof that he'd survived it. Behind him came Iris, her hand clasped with his, their connection visible now as threads of silver light that wove between them, undeniable evidence of a bond the pack had been taught was impossible. The gathered wolves went absolutely silent. An older woman stepped forward from the council members. The oracle, Iris sensed through the bond. She'd been the one who'd sensed Iris's awakening, who'd sent Alaric to find her. Her face was lined with centuries, but her eyes held the clarity of someone who'd always known this moment would come. "The curse is broken," the oracle said, her voice carrying across the clearing with the weight of prophecy. "The blood bond is completed, but at what cost?" "The cost was truth," Iris said, and her voice was different now, layered with the resonance of both her consciousness and Alaric's, speaking as two people who'd learned to share a single voice. "The cost was accepting that the curse was never real, that for 700 years our bloodline has been poisoning itself by believing in a story." A murmur ran through the gathered pack, confusion, denial, anger. But there was also something else. Recognition. The faintest acknowledgement that what she was saying touched some deep truth that had always existed beneath the surface. "The prophecy spoke of an Omega who would break the curse," one of the council alphas said, stepping forward. His face was scarred, marked with the symbols of his authority. "It did not speak of creating an abomination. A mated pair should never be bonded to the level you've achieved. The distinction between Alpha and Omega is the foundation of our entire social structure." "The distinction is a lie," Alaric said quietly, but there was nothing quiet in the power behind his words. Through the unified bond, Iris felt the full weight of his 342 years pressing against the words, lending them the gravity of lived experience. "I've lived long enough to know. I've spent enough of my existence believing in that lie. And Omega's power is not lesser. It's different. And a pack built on genuine equality is stronger than one built on hierarchy maintained by fear. You speak heresy, another council member said. But even she sounded uncertain. The rogue leader, standing at the edge of the gathering in human form, spoke up. I spent centuries believing the old stories too. I became so devoted to ideology that I forgot to think for myself. And then, he looked at Iris and Alaric. Then I was shown something different. A bond that wasn't about control. Two souls choosing each other, moment by moment, with full knowledge of what they were choosing. If that's heresy, then perhaps heresy is what we need. An alpha with pure silver fur, one of the ancient ones, began to shift back to human form. Then another, and another. Iris sensed their thoughts through the network of consciousness that every pack member shared. They were old enough to remember times before the curse had become absolute doctrine. Old enough to recall stories of Omegas who'd been warriors, leaders, equals in every way. But there was still resistance. Deep, foundational resistance from those whose entire sense of power depended on Omegas being categorized as less. You'll have to challenge the council, the scarred Alpha said. Prove your worth through the ancient trials. If you survive that, if you can demonstrate that your bond strengthens rather than weakens you, then perhaps we can discuss what this new world looks like. Iris felt Alaric's moment of concern. These trials were designed to be near-fatal tests of an alpha's power. The council had been using them for centuries to maintain control, ensuring that only the strongest, most ruthless alphas could challenge their authority. But Iris wasn't afraid. Through the bond, she let him feel her certainty, her understanding of what they were truly capable of when acting as one consciousness in two bodies. We accept the trials, she and Alaric said together, their voices perfectly synchronized. The challenge erupted across the clearing like wildfire. The council arranged 3 tests: combat against chosen alphas, a test of magical endurance in the sacred mountain space, and finally, the binding trial, where they would have to hold their bond intact while being psychically attacked by the entire council simultaneously. The first trial was physical. 2 council alphas in their most powerful wolf forms against Alaric. But Iris wasn't separate from that battle. She fought through him, her consciousness guiding his movements, her Omega magic enhancing his alpha strength in ways that created something entirely new. Where traditional alphas relied on dominance and force, she and Alaric fought with grace and precision, with an understanding of their enemy's weakness that came from seeing through multiple perspectives simultaneously. They won without seriously injuring their opponents, a decision that shocked the council. Mercy, demonstrated while utterly, unquestionably dominant. It sent a message. Strength didn't require cruelty. The second trial was magical. They stood in the center of the sacred circle while the council channeled raw power toward them, trying to break their bond through sheer force. But Iris and Alaric's connection was too deep, too organic. Each attack only made them stronger, only reinforced the threads of silver that held them together. They transformed the council's own power, reflecting it back not as a weapon but as a mirror, showing each council member directly the truth of their own fear and hunger for control. Several council members wept at the sight of themselves reflected back so honestly. The final trial was the binding test. The entire pack surrounded them, alphas and omegas alike, and the council led a coordinated psychic assault designed to shatter the bond by making them experience the worst possible versions of themselves, all the guilt, all the shame, all the potential ways they could fail or hurt each other. But Iris and Alaric had already looked into the darkest parts of their own consciousness. They'd already faced the worst versions of themselves and chosen to love anyway. The council's weapons couldn't touch them because they were already armed against their own darkness. And as the assault continued, something unexpected happened. The rogue leader and several of his followers joined the bond, not merging with Iris and Alaric's consciousness, but adding their strength to it, their belief in the possibility of transformation. Then the oracle stepped forward and added her voice, her understanding that this prophecy had always been about breaking not just a curse, but the very structures that had enabled the curse to exist. One by one, those who'd been searching for a reason to believe in something different added their power to the resistance. Until finally, the council's assault faltered. They couldn't overcome not just two people, but a movement. They couldn't destroy a bond that had become a philosophy. The scarred Alpha lowered his hands, and the psychic pressure ceased. "The trials are complete," he said, and his voice held something like respect. "You have proven yourselves, not as conquerors, but as something we haven't seen before, a union of equal power, a consciousness that doesn't demand submission but invites evolution." He paused, and Iris sensed the weight of the moment. The council was on the edge of a decision that would reshape everything. "The curse is broken," the oracle said again, but this time she was smiling. "And something far more powerful has taken its place. A new kind of pack, a new way of being together. The question is, how many of us are brave enough to follow?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pregnant with possibility, with the knowledge that the world had shifted on its axis, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. 3 months later, the cabin had been rebuilt, not on the same foundation. That space was now a memorial to what had been lost and found there. Instead, Iris and Alaric's home rose on the hill overlooking Millbrook Road, a structure of glass and stone that was neither entirely pack territory nor entirely human world. It existed in the liminal space they'd created, visible to both and belonging to neither completely. Iris stood on the balcony as sunset painted the mountains in shades of amber and rose, her hand resting on the railing, her consciousness half merged with Alaric's as he prepared dinner in the kitchen below. The unified consciousness that bound them was no longer strange. It had become as natural as breathing. Two people who existed separately but thought, felt, and loved together. The rogue leader had taken a new name, Victor. He'd established a sanctuary lodge in the northern peaks for Omegas discovering their own power, training them in the strength that had been systematically hidden from their bloodline for centuries. The Oracle had begun rewriting the pack's histories, removing the curse narrative, and revealing the original texts that had documented a different kind of relationship between alphas and omegas, one based on partnership rather than hierarchy. But the transformation wasn't universal. Some council members had refused to accept the new paradigm. They'd splintered away, forming smaller packs in remote territories, still clinging to the old stories. It was tragic, but also necessary. You couldn't force evolution. You could only create the conditions for it and let individuals choose. "Come down," Alaric called through their bond. "The light is perfect right now." She found him on the lower terrace, where he'd set up a simple meal, bread and cheese and wine, nothing elaborate. But through their connection, she could feel the love in every gesture, every choice he'd made to create this moment. They ate as the sun descended, and he told her about a letter he'd received from his oldest living cousin, someone who'd broken from the council decades ago and now lived in hiding in the human world. "I always knew the stories were wrong," the letter had read, "but I never had the courage to say so. Thank you for being brave enough for all of us." "Do you ever regret it?" Iris asked softly. "Leaving your position? Letting the council devolve into smaller factions?" Alaric took her hand, and the simple touch sent ripples of contentment through their unified consciousness. Every day I regret the pain it caused, but I don't regret the choice itself. Power built on lies isn't power. It's just imprisonment that everyone agreed to participate in. He paused, and she felt something shift in his consciousness: nervousness, anticipation, vulnerability. "What?" she asked, sensing there was more. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object. Not the locket, that remained on the altar in the sanctuary, a monument to her mother's courage. This was something new. A ring made of silver and moonstone, carved with runes that matched the patterns on the sanctuary walls. "I know we're already bonded at a level most pairs never achieve," Alaric said. "But I wanted to ask anyway. Will you marry me? Will you do it in front of the pack, in front of the humans, in front of everyone? Will you make it permanent in the ways that matter to society as well as to our souls?" Iris felt tears on her cheeks before she fully understood she was crying. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude that this man, who'd spent centuries believing he was a plague, had learned to dream of a future where he was worthy of being chosen, not just magically bonded. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to everything. Yes to forever." He slipped the ring on her finger, and it settled there like it had always belonged. Like her mother had been waiting centuries for this moment, had hidden herself in the human world specifically so that her daughter could have the freedom to choose this. The wedding took place on the winter solstice. The sanctuary was restored, its walls gleaming with fresh runes carved by a collective of omegas and alphas working side by side. The oracle presided, but so did the rogue leader. So did the scarred Council Alpha, who'd finally admitted that the old ways had been built on fear. So did representatives from the human world, Iris's estranged father, who'd spent his entire marriage to her mother, not knowing she was magic, but who'd loved her anyway, had believed in her anyway. The ceremony was unlike anything the pack had seen before. There were no declarations of possession, no traditional alpha dominance displays. Instead, Iris and Alaric stood facing each other, and they opened themselves completely to the gathered witnesses. They let everyone present see the truth of their bond, not as a conquest or a cure, but as two equal souls choosing to intertwine forever. The pack howled in approval, and in that howl, Iris heard something she hadn't expected: hope. Not the desperate hope of a civilization clinging to ancient stories, but the genuine hope of people finally seeing possibilities they'd never been allowed to imagine before. A year after the wedding, the first generation of equal-trained Omegas began taking positions of leadership within the pack's territory. They worked alongside Alphas, not beneath them. They made decisions about governance, hunting, territory expansion. And the pack didn't collapse. It didn't descend into chaos. Instead, it became stronger, more nuanced, more adaptive, more truly powerful because it drew on the full potential of every individual rather than suppressing half its members. Some of the isolated rogue packs began to reach out, curious about the new paradigm. Victor worked with Iris to develop training programs that could help Omegas from those communities reclaim the power that had been hidden from them. Alaric's curse marks continued to fade, until by the second year, they were barely visible, thin silver lines that looked almost like intentional decoration rather than scars of inherited trauma. But he never had them completely removed. He wanted to remember what he'd overcome, wanted to carry the physical reminder that transformation was possible. On their second anniversary, Iris discovered she was pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through both pack and human communities. An Omega carrying an Alpha's child, something the old teachings said should be impossible, should result in death and corruption. But Iris was healthy, radiant, carrying their daughter safely in her womb. The pregnancy was proof, undeniable and physical, that the old stories had been lies all along. "What will we name her?" Alaric asked one night, his hand resting on Iris's growing belly, feeling their daughter move beneath his palm. "Something that means choice," Iris said. "Something that means freedom. Something that means she gets to decide who she becomes without anyone else's expectations written into her name." Alaric smiled against her shoulder. "Like her mother." "Like both her mothers and fathers," Iris corrected. "I think she's going to need a lot of examples of people who broke the rules and built something better." Through the window, the mountains held their ancient, patient watch. The forest that had once felt haunted and mysterious now felt like home. And somewhere in the liminal spaces between pack territory and human world, between old magic and new possibility, a child was preparing to be born into a world that her parents had transformed. A world where Omega and Alpha could be equal, where strength didn't require domination, where the strongest bonds were built not on control, but on the courageous, endless choice to see another soul completely and love it anyway. Epilogue. 5 years later, little Alara sat on her father's shoulders as the pack gathered for the winter solstice ceremony. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's golden eyes, and when she laughed, the sound carried notes of both Omega and Alpha magic woven together. "Will there be wolves tonight?" she asked. "There will be," Alaric promised. "But they'll all be choice, little one. Everyone who shifts will be choosing to do so. That's the difference in our world now." Iris watched them from across the clearing, and she felt the gentle pulse of their unified consciousness, no longer as intense as it had been in those early days, but present and peaceful. They'd learned to exist as separate people who could choose to merge, rather than two souls locked in eternal unity. It was, she'd discovered, the most powerful way to love someone, to retain your independence while choosing, moment after moment, to intertwine. The oracle approached her, and they embraced like family, because that's what they'd become, a new kind of family, built across boundaries that society had once said were unbridgeable. "Your mother would be proud," the oracle said softly. Iris nodded, touching the locket she still wore beneath her shirt. Inside was a new picture now, not just her mother's face, but the image of two women side by side, hand in hand, the bloodline continuing forward. The future was still being written. There were still communities that resisted the new paradigm, still individuals who believed the old stories were better, still challenges that arose from centuries of ingrained hierarchy. But there was also this: a family that existed across the divide, a daughter born from a union that should have been impossible, a world slowly, steadily, learning to imagine differently. As the sun set and the pack began to gather, Iris felt Alaric's consciousness brush against hers. A gentle greeting, a question. "Are you ready?" She smiled up at him, at their daughter laughing in the golden light, and answered through their bond, "Always. As long as we're choosing it together." And that, in the end, was the real magic. Not the rituals or the runes or the mystical power that flowed through their bloodlines, but simply this: two people, and later three, and eventually a community, choosing each other, again and again and again, breaking old curses, building new worlds. learning, moment by moment, what love could actually be when you stopped believing in the lies.